will be done. He's not going to listen to us. And so this is kind of like that, putting the first option last. It's like Luke said, we all got in this huddle and we said, okay, he's not going to listen, so we might as well just commit it to the Lord. Paul had already done that. Paul committed it to the Lord first, which is what his friends probably should have done. Now, I want you to, I'm going to say something that's going to sound harsh. Over the last 20 centuries or so of church history, Paul has gotten a very high respect, and probably rightfully so. I mean, we talk about Paul. As a matter of fact, when you talk about the Bible, you automatically put Jesus first. And then I would think maybe 80%, maybe upwards of 80% would list Paul second. If they're, because the man wrote 100 chapters of the New Testament. He founded 3 churches all over the known world at the time. And so over the last 20 centuries of church history, Paul's got this almost superhuman reputation. You know, people elevate and they worship Paul. However, when Luke wrote Acts, Paul was one of the most controversial and divisive people that the church knew. This is what I'm telling you. That's what I told you a while ago. Everywhere he went, there was problems. It wasn't necessarily Paul's. It could have been Paul's fault, because there's a right way and a wrong way to deliver the message. You know, you can tell somebody they're going to hell in a nice way. You know, and I kind of think Paul took the more direct approach, and I think he alienated a lot of people. And so look what Luke is doing. And if you're a serious Bible student of the New Testament, or of Pauline theology, the history of Paul, the studies of Paul, it's very apparent what's happening right here. Luke is going out of his way to paint Paul in a really good light, because Luke don't want us to know that Paul was so controversial. And I'm not saying controversial as in he's just trying to start trouble. I'm saying controversial as in he's very direct. And he didn't care whose feelings he hurt, and he don't care what he says. The truth is the truth, and I think Paul's going to say it. And so, as a result, he became very controversial, especially when Paul wrote this, or Luke wrote this. Because everywhere he goes in Acts, there's a problem. Somebody's trying to kill him. Somebody's upset at Christians. Somebody's chasing him out of the city. There's always a problem. And so Luke, I think, is trying to paint Paul in the best light possible. Not so much for me and you, because we know Paul's history. If I say the Apostle Paul, you immediately have respect. The earliest Christians that read the book of Acts would not have had that respect for Paul. They would have said, oh, there's that troublemaker. He caused problems in Corinth and Ephesus and Philippi, and everywhere that man goes, he just caused a fight. And so Luke is, I think, trying to go out of his way, so when people read this, they see Luke in a more positive light, if that makes sense. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Now look at verse 15. After these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea also came with us, taking us to Manason of Cyprus, a disciple of long standing, with whom we were to lodge. So they got to go another 65 miles southeast from Caesarea Maritima. It took us about 40 minutes on a bus. It would have took them 2 days walking. So they set out, and they go stay at this guy's house when they get there. Verse 17, when we arrived in Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the following day, Paul went in with us to James. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. Because what happened to James, John's brother, the apostle? He's already been martyred. He was the first martyr to be killed. Herod killed him first thing. And so James, the apostle, is gone. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. He's the leader of the Jerusalem church. He was for years. So they get to Jerusalem, and the Christians in Jerusalem, The Hebraic Jews, those Messianic Jews, they received them well. And then they hooked up with James, the pastor of the church there. Verse 19, after he had greeted them, he began to relate one by one the things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. That's what Paul always did. Go into a new place and tell the Jewish Christians there how God has been blessed. And that's what he did. Verse 20, and when they had heard it, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they're all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the custom. So here's the lies that are kind of coming out of all this. First of all, they glorified God. They say, thank God he's saving people. Y'all are doing a great work. And then they say, but wait a minute, we need to tell you something. Because there's about 30 to 50,000 inhabitants of Jerusalem at this time, and Paul's reputation had preceded him. They had heard. And so and from here on out through Acts, Paul is going to argue. It's going to be just a series of arguments, and he's going to be, it's the same argument that he's a dedicated Jew. That's the same argument. Because look at the accusation. They've just been told that you're teaching Jewish people to not obey the law of Moses. Well, he was, yeah. But he wasn't doing it so much as don't obey the law. He was saying it in regards to, we have a new law now. Christ has given us a new law. But the one that really gets him is the circumcision. He said, you're even telling them not to circumcise. It's not true. How do we know for a fact that that's not true? Because he had Timothy circumcised when Timothy converted over. So they're making up these lies about him, which are true in a sense, but not really. They're saying you're telling the Jews to oppose what Moses had written. Now, look at verse 22 through 24. The elders had a plan. And the elders' plan was to prove to the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and to all the Jews there that Paul did not abandon Judaism. That's their plan. We're going to convince all these people that you didn't abandon Judaism. Now, what did he abandon? He abandoned the principle of Judaism that said basically that salvation came by obeying the Mosaic law. He abandoned that. He said, I don't believe that anymore. I used to kill Christians for not, but I don't believe that anymore. He's still a racial Jew. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. He's a racial Jew. He's not a ceremonial Jew anymore. He don't practice all that stuff, but he's still a Jew. And so these James and these Christians are saying to him, you got a bad reputation. And the thing we have to do is convince them that you're still on their side, because they think you've abandoned everything. So that's going to be the plan. So look at verse 22 and 24. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do this that we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. So these 4 guys in the city took a vow. Some people think it was a Nazirite vow. I don't think that's possible, because a Nazirite vow takes 30 days to complete. This didn't take place over 30 days. I think it was just a vow like Paul took, temporary vow that they're going to do something, and they're going to follow through with it. So at the end of the vows, the guys are supposed to go to the temple and take an offering. So that's why they're bringing this up. Paul said, okay, you guys have a plan. What are we going to do? They said, we got these 4 guys that are currently under this vow. So verse 24, take them and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and all will know that there is nothing to the things which they have been told about you, but that you yourself also walk orderly, keeping the law. So take those guys, take those 4 men, go with them to the temple, purify yourself with them, do all the things for temple worship, and show your support of the Jewish community by taking an offering to the temple. That's their big plan. And this is going to tie into King Agrippa a little bit later. So Paul could have done that without compromising his Christian convictions. It would have been easy, because the Jews did not believe taking a vow meant acceptance by God, that it's a voluntary thing. And so Paul doing this would have showed them that he's voluntarily lining himself up with Judaism. Look at verse 25. But concerning the Gentiles who have believed, we wrote, having decided that they should abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took them in, and next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completion of the days of purification until the sacrifice was offered for each one of them. So that's what he does. Now, here, I'll tell you, there's trouble everywhere with Paul. Here's where the trouble comes into play. Look at verse 27. And we'll be getting close to wrapping this up. Look at verse 27. When the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law in this place. And besides, he has even brought brought Greek into the temple and has defiled the holy place." Here's what they're saying. The Jewish folks are in an uproar. They don't like Paul anyway. They see him in the temple with these 4 Gentile converts. He brings them to the temple. The temple is laid out in squares. The outer square is the court of the Gentiles. Oh, Gentiles can go to that. And there's a wall around it. And then inside that wall is the court of women. That's where the ladies go and they worship. Inside that is a square that's the court of the Jews, court of Israel. And the Jewish people can go inside that. And then inside that there's a court of priests. And only the priests go in there, the Levites pretty much. And then inside that, excuse me, is the holy place. Only the high priest can go in that one time a year. Here's what they're accusing Paul of. They're saying to Paul, and it's what he did. This is why he's a troublemaker, but he's doing it for the right reason. Those 4 guys should have stopped at the court of the Gentiles. They're Gentiles. They're converts, but they're not Jews. Paul brings them past the Gentile court, past the women's court, into the court of the Jews. And so Paul's in there just like, hey, we're purifying ourselves, we're making our offering, we're doing everything we're supposed to do. And they see it and they say, look what he's doing. He's making a mockery of what we stand for. And so they grab hold of him and they basically drag him out. Look at verse 27. As a matter of fact, the barrier to that court is called a sorek, and they had signs there, and the signs were written in several languages, most often in Latin and Greek, so everybody could read it. Here's what the sign said: "No man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure around the temple, and whoever is caught will have himself to blame, that his death ensues." That's the sign that Paul walked right past. They had this sign up said, nobody but our people can come through here. And if you do, your death's on your hands. And Paul just takes them right through there. They just walk right past the sign, walk right past all the ladies in there praying, and they go straight into the to the Israeli temple. Look at verse 29. I'm sorry. Verse 29. For they had previously seen Trophimus. That's the guy they saw. He's the Ephesian, the Gentile companion. He was one of them in there with Paul. Verse 30. Then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. So he drug him out and shut the door. Verse 31 and 32. While they were seeking to kill him, a report came up to the commander of the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem, and this commander of this cohort was the commander of the Antonia fortress. His name was Claudius. Probably had about 1,000 soldiers underneath him. And so while all this is going on, the report came up, and it said, let me find it again. Commander of the Roman court, that all Jerusalem was in confusion. At once he took along some soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Verse 33. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And he began asking who he was and what he had done. So there he is. And there's 2 schools of thoughts on this. There's an Antonia fortress on the other coast. It's probably where Jesus was tortured and interrogated and all that. And from there, Jesus took the Via Dolorosa to the cross. And there was a commander in there. Thank you, Dwight. I'm sorry. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Felt like it. So they had this commander in there with 1,000 troops. And, I mean, imagine the scene in Jerusalem. They drag Paul out of the temple, and they're out there beating him in the street. And all these Jews run over to watch it. And so somebody runs into the fortress and says, hey, he's got trouble out there. Claudius didn't care about one Christian guy getting beat to death. He didn't care. He did care that that Jerusalem was in a state of confusion, because it was his job to keep peace in the city. And so he goes out there, and when they saw the commander come, they stopped beating him. So look at verse 33. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, which means there was a guard on one side and a guard on the other side. So Paul had chains on his hands, guards on the side. Verse 34. But among the crowd, some were shouting one thing and some another, and when he could not find out the facts because of the uproar, he ordered him to be brought into the barracks, into the Antonia fortress. Verse 35, when he got to the stairs, he was carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. He was beaten so badly he couldn't walk up the stairs by himself. And so they took him upstairs. Verse 36, for the multitude of the people kept following them, shouting, away with him. That is their way to say kill him. That's what they shouted 27 years earlier when Jesus was right there in that same spot. So verse 37, as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the commander, may I say something to you? And he said, do you know Greek? Then you are not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness. So the commander thought that Paul was an Egyptian that had visited there earlier, that had led an insurrection with some assassins. And when Paul started speaking Greek, and he didn't really, it says Greek, he spoke Aramaic, which is the dialect for that area. And only this area would have spoke that. And so he said, you speak our language. So evidently you're not that Egyptian guy. Verse 39, Paul said, I am a Jew of Tarsus in Cilicia. I'm a Jew by birth. I'm a citizen of no insignificant city. In other words, Tarsus is a big city. I come from a big, important city. And I beg you, allow me to speak to your people. When he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the stairs, motioned to the people with his hand, like, be quiet. Hold his hand like, hey, be quiet. And when there was a great hush, he spoke to them in the Hebrew dialect, that Aramaic, say. And then chapter 22 is his speech. Chapter 22 is one of the clearest arguments for salvation, the clarity and simplicity of salvation. Paul's not going to try to defend himself. He's going to give an apology for the gospel. He's going to defend God and talk about salvation in Christ. So see what I'm talking about? Paul, in this day, he's equated to a troublemaker. And so Luke is trying to write to these first readers, hey, this guy's not as bad as you heard he is. He's got some good in him. Any questions?